Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Leibowitz. With us today, we have an objectivist who is trained in the Montessori method of teaching children, parent effectiveness training, and was a licensed therapist for parents and their children. Catherine Dickerson, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Michael. I'm pleased to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, when you reached out to me, you mentioned that you were a long-time objectivist. So, how long have you been an objectivist, and what initially drew you to the philosophy?
Well, I'm 72 now, and I first read The Fountainhead when I was 14.
Oh, wow.
I didn't understand any of the philosophy at all. I just knew that that was the way to live. That's all I knew. And so I started on my journey to figure that out. And it was a very long and difficult journey, but I got there.
Well, that is indeed a long time. So, what can you tell us about the Montessori method? Am I pronouncing that right? Montessori?
Montessori, yes.
Okay. What can you tell us about it?
Well, when I was a Montessori teacher, that's how I started my career with young children. It was the most fun job I've ever had. And one of the things that really stood out was it felt like the sky was the limit to what the children could learn in the classroom. And I had children who wanted to come to school on Saturday because they were having so much fun. Montessori was one of the first woman doctors in Italy. And she was a keen scientific observer. And in observing children, I've got a quote that I'd like to read from her. She said, "I watched them seeking to understand the secret of these souls, of whose greatness I had been so ignorant. As I stood in meditation among the eager children, the discovery that it was knowledge they loved and not the silly game filled me with wonder and made me think of the greatness of the human soul." So she saw in children something that no one had ever seen, that they have incredibly active minds and they're ravenous to fill them with knowledge and information. And I always add that they have a tremendous desire to master the world and themselves, starting from infancy, when that newborn starts rooting for his mother's breast, or when he starts looking around to try to see what he can see. Those are right at birth, the first signs of an active mind, trying to figure out and understand and eventually master the world. So she saw in children what nobody saw. And then through her observation and through her study, she developed what she called the prepared environment, full of gorgeous, irresistible materials that just called out to be touched and explored, that broke learning stages down into steps. And I'll give you an example. In Montessori, children learn to write before they learn to read, because their motor skills are develop earlier. Every puzzle in a Montessori classroom has small pegs. Oh, my puzzle's downstairs. I should have brought that up. But anyway, the way you hold the pegs, they're small, is exactly the way you hold a pencil. So from when they start doing puzzles, children are developing a pencil grasp without any direction. It's just natural. You have to hold the puzzle pieces like this. You can't pick them up like this. You have to. So they start right from the very beginning. And then she has a whole series of sensorial exercises, the sandpaper letters, the movable alphabet. I don't have samples of those, where children gradually learn to put sounds together and create words. And before you know it, they're writing, and then they're reading. And one of the things that I just love to do was children would draw a picture, and I would have them dictate to me about the picture, and I would write it out really slowly, sounding out every letter, like the cat. And then they would start to take over.
I
That give
first
you an
came.
idea?
Oh, yes, yes. The first time I ever came across Maria Montessori was actually in the same book that introduced me to Ayn Rand. It was a book called The Triumph of Liberty by Jim Powell, and it was 64 mini biographies of people that helped to advance the cause of freedom. And I was interested in the Montessori method almost immediately, but I've never done any additional reading on it. And I've tried to get people to come on to talk about it, but I've been unable to find anybody, of course, until now. Now, you were a practicing psychotherapist for parents and children. You were trained
Mostly
in,
for children, and then I learned as a Montessori teacher that children come with parents.
yes, they do. Yes.
And I mean, before my first semester as a teacher, their parents were saying, we want to know how to get our children to behave at home the way they do in your classroom. Because people would look at my classroom was on the way into the school, and there was a big window. So everybody who came into the school could look into my classroom. And there were 12, 18 months to 3-year-olds busily working away. And people would say, how do you make them all do that? I'd say, you don't make 12 2-year-olds do anything. I've learned how to offer them irresistible invitations. And the fact is, they want to do all the cool stuff that their parents do, right? Their parents are gods to them, and they want to be just like them. So they want to cook and clean, and they don't want to just play. Another important thing about Montessori is she understood that knowledge is based in sensory experience. So she really understood starting with concretes and moving to abstract. And in preparing for this, I read an interesting excerpt where she talked about moms who are at risk of their children getting rickets, getting lectured to by the doctors about the early signs of rickets. But it went completely over their head because they didn't know how to observe carefully enough to notice those early signs because their senses were not trained. So there's a tremendous emphasis on sense training in Montessori. It's as the basis of all knowledge. It's very exciting and so much fun.
At some point, you came across the work of Thomas Gordon, his parent effectiveness training, and there was an attraction there as well. So, can you tell us a little bit about the basic principles of parent effectiveness training? We'll call it PET from now on. And how does it gel?
How about PET? Would that be okay?
Okay, PET is good. And how does it gel with objectivism and the Montessori method?
Well, I'll tell you briefly how I found it. So I've been teaching parents since I first started working with children. And I've taught a variety of different parenting classes. I've created some of my own, but I was always kept looking for one. And with lots of reading and lots of searching, I came across Thomas Gordon, and I said, this is it. This is the gold standard. And the reason it's the gold standard, because Thomas Gordon understands, like no one else I've ever seen in the parenting field, that each individual has to do their own thinking. And every skill that he teaches is about getting out of children's way because they're already thinking much more than people give them credit for, and then nurturing that thinking. But everybody, even babies, have to do their own thinking. They need more help than an adult does, but everybody does their own thinking. And that's my phrase. That's not a quote from him.
So that sounds a lot like the objectivist virtue of independence.
Exactly.
Where we all have to think for ourselves. Nobody can think for us.
Yes.
So with that in mind, there are an abundance of components to PET. And I'd just like you to tell us about a few of them. We can start with the behavior window.
Thank you. And I'd like to just point out how it fits with Montessori also.
Okay.
I think this is so brilliant. These are a couple of quotes from Montessori. Little children, from the moment in which they are weaned, are making their way toward independence. The essence of independence is to be able to do something for oneself. And of course, one of the things that Ms. Rand said about independence was one's acceptance of the responsibility of forming one's own judgment and of living by the work of one's own mind is the virtue of independence. So this is where all three, objectivism, Montessori, and PET, converge. So the behavior window, I should have gotten one out for you. Hold on. Well, the behavior window, it's a window broken up into categories. And the first question to ask is there a problem? Or am I just annoyed because it doesn't perfectly fit me, right? But it's not really causing me a problem. Does the other person own the problem? Do I own the problem? Or do we both own the problem? And you use different skills depending on whose problem it is. One of the first things that we talk about is who owns the problem. And a lot of parents are really relieved that the many problems they thought they had to solve actually belong to their children. Like if somebody's not invited to a party and is really upset about it, the parent can do everything they need to do. None of their needs are interfered with. It's the child who owns the problem. Or even, yeah. So that's an example. So a lot of parents are really relieved that they don't have to solve every problem in the world that crosses their. And the skill that you use for when someone else, the basic skill when someone else owns a problem, is what Thomas Gordon calls active listening. Now, lots of people teach active listening, and I've been to many workshops on active listening, but nobody teaches it like Thomas Gordon does. He teaches 12 roadblocks that people use that actually discourage conversation because it's the way of that adult taking over the thinking process. Like if someone else has a problem and you start peppering them with questions, you're trying to figure out how to solve the problem, right? So you're directing which way the thinking goes. So you're doing the thinking for that other person. Whereas if instead you use Thomas Gordon's method of active listening, where you listen and like a mirror, you reflect back what the other person is saying and how they're saying it. So you're reflecting back your understanding of what they've told you, both verbally and non-verbally. I think that the non-verbal is the subconscious part. Sometimes you don't realize you're looking as tense as you are, right? So you reflect that back, and the person sees themselves, and you do it accepting, not agreeing with them, but accepting that how they think right now and how they feel right now is how they think and feel right now, and accepting that fact, not trying to change them, not trying to analyze it, not trying to make them feel better or talk them into, just accepting that that's where they are. And then they get to see where they are and they go, yeah, and maybe they'll tell you some more, and you'll reflect that back, and they get a clearer and clearer picture of their situation. And they start to go, oh, well, maybe if I did this, or they start to solve their own problem before your very eyes with the information that you've helped them be conscious of. It's a very powerful skill.
A good friend of mine who is also a radio talk show host told me once that people tend to talk to others the same way that they talk to themselves. And when I talk to when I talk to myself, I'm confrontational, and I debate with myself, and I work through propositions in the evidence of a given claim, whether it be about me, the world, anybody else. And I tend to do that with other people as well. I often treat a conversation as if it's a debate. So what you're talking about, active listening, runs so counter. Now, I've read so much on this subject, but it's so counter to I don't know if it's a natural inclination, but the inclination that I have. How can I learn to use this more consistently and more effectively?
You can take my class. You can read the book. This level of respect and respecting the other person's thinking was so radically different from the way I was raised. Then when I read the book several times, and they give examples. The child will speak, and then they'll give the PET response. So I'd read with it, and I'd cover over the response. This is the third time I read the book. And I'd read it, oh, how did they get that? I had to take the training to be an instructor to understand PET. So it was so foreign to me. But some people can get it from the book. And I'm not the only one that teaches it. I'm the only one that teaches it geared toward objectivists. But a number of people teach it online. So it's at different times of the day and different days of the week for more convenience.
Now, one of the components also of PET is something I'm very familiar with, and that's iMessages. I used to, when I was incarcerated, we had this program called the Alternative to Violence Project, much of which I thought was pure just garbage. But the iMessages I always thought were important. And one of the reasons that I thought it was important was because when I use an iMessage, I own the situation. So it's about me. I can say, look, I don't like this. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It doesn't mean you've done anything wrong, but nonetheless, I don't like it. So I would like to come to a resolution. Like if I have a friend that's blasting loud music in the other room or whatever, it's my problem. It's based on what I value, what I'm trying to do. It's not that he's objectively doing something wrong necessarily. So if I communicate it, I have to own it. And then when you do that, the other person doesn't get put on the defensive. And I'm just wondering, as this is a method that deals with children and their parents, how do you teach parents to do that when talking with children? Because I would imagine that there's such a drive in parents to just do this because I say so type thing, right? So how do you teach them to do it? And is it effective when parents learn to do this with children?
Oh, Michael, it's tremendously effective because it's so respectful of the child's active mind, right? So the difference between do this because I said so, or just even just do this, is that I'm doing the thinking. I know I've figured out the solution, and all you have to do is obey, right? If instead you use an I message and give the child information about three things. One, exactly what they're doing. You're playing your radio at a high volume. They might not think it's loud. Two, I can't concentrate when it's this loud. Three, I'm worried I'm not going to be ready for my class tomorrow. So it's what you're doing, the impact it has on me, and how I feel about the impact. And I think the impact it has on me is the most important thing. And you give that information, you haven't said anything about the other person. You haven't attacked them or criticized them or insulted them or anything. And you haven't even told them what to do. You've just given them the information. And what's great about doing that with children is you give them a chance to fix the problem. So they're not the bad guy. They're not the problem in your life. And they get to fix it. And you know how that feels when you make a mistake and then you make it right? I've got goosebumps right now remembering how that feels. And for children, that's so nurturing, that they can be the good guy. They can make good things happen. And, they love their parents, no matter how obstreperous they are. They love their parents and they want their parents to love them. And they want to get along. They really do. They just don't know how. So they need our help.
Now,
I see
in
you
the
smiling. What do you think about that?
I'm just thinking about there's an aspect of the iMessages that I think is important, and I try to always bring stuff back to my own behavior and my own relationships, and often when I'll have I don't know, arguments the right word, but disagreements with my girlfriend, for instance, and I'll say something, and it's likely the way that I'm communicating it, right? So if I don't like a given thing that she does, I'll say it. And what she hears isn't, I don't like this behavior or this behavior is bad. What she hears is, I'm bad. You don't like me. And one of the things with the I messages is to focus on the behavior so that you're not condemning a person. Because there's a big difference between saying, I don't like when you sing in the car and you're a bad person because you sing in the car.
You're annoying me. Yeah.
Right. So, how does that aspect of it come about in your sessions with parents and children? The idea of focusing on the child's behavior.
Well, we just practice and practice. There's a lot of practice in PET and some discussion also, but a lot of practice. And I'm there to say, oh, I think I'm hearing an agenda here. Because I will confess, I thought I was active listening to my husband, but it wasn't working. And I didn't say active listening's not working. I'm saying there's something I'm missing here. And I realized that in my tone, I always had an agenda. So sometimes you can say the right words, but if your tone is so cut it out and now, then that nonverbal communication comes through and you end up giving a mixed message and it's not as clear and defensive. And in PET, we learn a skill called gear shifting, where you go back and so let's say I say, when you play your music at a high volume, I just can't concentrate, and I'm worried I won't be ready for my class tomorrow. And they go, "Oh, you're always complaining, blah blah blah." Then now they have a problem. I started when I have a problem. They didn't. They were happily playing their music, and now they have a problem. And I say, "Oh, you feel like criticizing you, and you feel like I'm constantly telling you, oh, oh, I'm glad you told me that. I didn't realize." And right now, I'm kind of stuck because you're enjoying your music, and I just can't concentrate. And I'm really worried about my class tomorrow. So do you hear can you imagine somebody calming down a little bit
Sure.
in response to that? I accept what they say. That's that active listening. If he said, you're always complaining, I don't say, I am not. And I have a perfectly good reason to, you're not, there's no defensiveness. There's just an exchange of information.
One thing I like about what you just said is you mentioned that sometimes when you're talking to your husband, you're not actively listening. The reason I like it is because I remember years ago, I read the book, The Psychology of Self Esteem by Nathaniel Branden. And what a great impact the book had on me. But part of the problem I had was it was like I was reading this book and I'm assuming that this guy who wrote it has perfected everything in here, right? Years later, of course, I read something by him where he talked about no, he does struggle with self esteem. So then my own struggles with self esteem become okay, they're more real. So if I were just to read your book, for instance, and I say, wow, this lady really has it figured out, and then if I'm trying to implement it and I don't, I might be prone to kind of beat myself up. I'll never get it, that sort of thing. But these are, I'm guessing, it seems lifelong techniques that need to be learned. And it doesn't mean, just even if we learn them all, doesn't mean that we won't fall short from them or stray at times, whatever, but that doesn't mean we don't keep striving to get better and better.
Exactly. Now, and I have to stress, it's not my book, it's Thomas Gordon's book.
Oh, you didn't write a book? I
No,
thought you
no,
wrote a
this
book.
is Thomas
Okay.
Gordon. This is his course. Thomas Gordon is the
Okay.
one who developed this. And you can get more information at gordontraining.com. Gordontraining.com. Lots of information on their website. So he wrote the book. And even he talks about how he made mistakes. And there's one that I love where we talked about he caught himself just in time. And he was very relieved to have done that. So yes, and in the class I make mistakes. And I really try to be sensitive to that and point them out and then correct myself. Because one of the super things about PET is you don't have to be even close to be perfect. You have to be sincere. You have to be what they call authentic. You have to really mean what you say. So if I say, I'm just trying to understand, but I really have an agenda, then I don't really mean what I say, right? But if you really can do it without an agenda, and that's a hard thing to overcome. And hardly any of us was raised with PET. So we have deeply long-lived ingrained habits to change. And I mentioned asking questions, and people are taught to ask questions of their children when they have a problem. A lot of parenting questions say, ask a lot of questions. Well, there's a time for questions, but when the other person has a problem, is not a time for questions. It's a time for listening and reflecting.
Have you ever heard the story where somebody asked Ayn Rand about John Galt? And they said, see, I just can't imagine John Galt. I'm probably going to get the story a little wrong, but I'll get the the essence of it. And they said, if John Galt's out to dinner and he's out on a date, he's not going to spill wine on himself. But I spill wine on myself and it's a disaster. And she said, no, if John Galt spills wine on himself, he understands it's not important. He recognizes he did it and he moves on. And I think that that's important because given that we're all going to make mistakes, right? If you're dealing with children, it's okay to make mistakes in front of them. But it seems to me that we would want to model how to deal with the making of a mistake. I remember in the Alternative to Violence project I told you about, I was once facilitating a workshop and I made a mistake. And I said, oh, yeah, I made a mistake. And then I just kept going. And one of the other facilitators said to me later, wow, that was impressive. You just admitted the mistake and kept going. And I'm thinking, well, it's not the end of the world. I made a mistake. So what? But I was able to model for the group what you do when you make a mistake. And I would imagine it's the same thing when you're teaching one of your courses, that or the parents are dealing with their children is you don't want to come off as if you know everything and are always right, because then the kid has unrealistic expectations. What you would want to do is just model the proper way to deal with mistakes. Is that accurate? Does that accurately describe how you engage with children?
Absolutely, Michael, because the fact is, you put a lot of pressure on yourself trying to come across as if you know everything. And a lot of parents think they're supposed to. They think they're supposed to be the God that their children think they are. And and no one is omniscient. No one is omnipotent. Mistakes are part of living. And to learn that and who was it that I just read? It might have been, oh, I forget. It might have been Bill Gates, but I'm not sure. That mistakes are part of learning. And you can't learn without making mistakes. So they're a gift. They're a good thing. Especially if you're doing your best and you make a mistake, then you go, oh, okay, so what do I need to adjust here? And sometimes some parents, when they make a mistake, they feel so terrible that they apologize. Oh, I'm so sorry. I was just talking to a mom recently who's very apologetic to her children. I said, what if you just said, whoops, let me fix that. Let me try that again. And you try it again. So that mistakes aren't this embarrassing, mortifying sin that you've committed. It's just an oops. Oops is one of my favorite words these days. Oops and Because when a child asks a question that I think they can probably figure out, I even go, so you're wondering about such and such. I wonder. And then they'll step in with some ideas.
Learning from mistakes. I remember watching an interview with Mike Tyson, and they were talking to him about his loss to Buster Douglas. And the guy said, that must be one of your least favorite fights. And he says, no, that's my favorite. He said, that's how you learn. It's how, you learn. I believe he said, it's how you learn about yourself, what you're made of. He said, I don't learn anything if I just go out there and beat the other guy up. And I thought that was very wise. Now, he's not the best example of wisdom for an abundance of other reasons, but with that, I think that he was right on point. Now, what I really want to know, and we've kind of laid the foundation, is I want to know what your experiences have been like implementing this method with parents, with kids, and the effectiveness of it.
So first of all, I think you're right. Michael Tyson is not an example of a good character, but he's certainly an example of a champion mindset.
Sure.
And most of the really top performers in business and elsewhere that I've read, that's their view of mistakes as great learning opportunities, and they welcome them and they make them all the time. I'll tell you a couple of stories.
Okay.
Recently, a mom who was taking the training, there's not just parent effectiveness training, but also leader effectiveness training, teacher effectiveness training, and youth effectiveness training. And they all use exactly the same principles, the same skills. So one of my PET students was taking the leaderness effective. She thought it was so terrific. She wanted to go and teach it to her business colleagues. And we had lunch, and she said, I want to show you a letter from my daughter. And her daughter had written her a letter while she was at a sleepover. And she said, Mom, thank you so much for letting me be me. All my friends are complaining about their parents, and I don't have anything to say. Her mother was really moved by that, as was I. So that was a teenager. Another teenager example, I'm going to give you 3 or 4, if that's okay.
Sure.
Another teenager, I had just learned PET. As I used to be, I thought, oh, I'll never be good enough. So my first client walks in Monday morning, a teenager that I hadn't met before. I was working at a high-risk a clinic for high-risk kids that all seen numerous therapists. It was a long waiting list to get in. He walks into my room. He sits down. He crosses his arms. He turns his back and he says, I don't talk to therapists. So I active listened. He talked nonstop for 40 minutes. I had to interrupt him and tell him we have 10 minutes left. He goes, I haven't told you about my girlfriend yet. He was desperate, absolutely desperate to talk to someone who would try to understand him, not fix him, not change him, just understand him and accept him right now for who he is right now. Now, I disagree with almost everything he does in his life, but I accepted what he was thinking and how he was feeling. And he was desperate for that. And what I've learned, I was an experiential play therapist. And what I've learned as a therapist is that all children are desperate to tell people. They'd love to be able to tell their parents if their parents had the skill of listening, right? They are desperate to tell somebody what's going on with them. They're desperate to share their triumphs. They're desperate to share their fears. They really, really want to communicate. So those kids who are shutting down, they've been roadblocked, as to use Thomas Gordon's word. Now, I'll give you one other example. I was at a workshop in London that ARC UK invited me to give. And one of the kids clearly had some neurological challenges. He had difficulty with self-regulation. And he really wanted to use this puzzle box. And someone was using it. And he wanted to use it right now. And he didn't have much self-regulation skill. So he was really intense. He really wanted. And I kept saying, you just want to use that right now. You really don't want to have to wait. And Peter is still working with it. As soon as he's finished, you can have a turn. And everybody was just waiting for this kid to explode. I was too. But I said, Catherine, trust yourself. Trust Thomas Gordon. Just keep active listening. And I did, and I did, and I did. And he finally just melted into my arms. Completely relaxed. And I was just talking to a friend who was there. She goes, I couldn't believe that. I knew he was going to blow up. And I didn't know what we were going to do then because he was a big kid. We were going to have a big problem. But he just melted. And accepted that he had to wait because I kept telling him, it's hard to wait. You don't want to wait. You want it now. And Andrew's not quite finished. When he's finished, you can have a turn. Andrew, will you tell Peter, I'm getting my name. Peter, will you tell Andrew, and these are not their real names, when you're finished so he can have a turn? And he just melted. I'll always remember that little boy. I love him.
What you mentioned about people wanting to be heard resonates so strongly with me. When I was in high school, I was thrown out of my public high school and I had to go to a high school for troubled kids. And as part of that, we each had to have a therapist in the school that we would talk to once a week. Now, I was a hellraiser. I had no interest at all in becoming a better person, improving myself, or learning anything. But I looked forward every week to being able to go talk to the therapist. And I realized then, even at that young age, 16, 17, just how much I liked to talk, just to be listened to was so powerful. And somebody asked me recently about getting podcast guests. And they said, well, if you're not paying people to come on, why do these people come on? And I mean, I've reached out to some, pretty within the spheres that I operate in, some pretty famous people, and they come on. And I said, well, people like to talk about what interests them. It's almost a human propensity, maybe not for everybody, but for most of us, we like to be heard, we like to tell our story, talk about the things that we value, and share them. So I would imagine that you're giving these kids such a powerful experience when you're actually just listening to them. You're not treating them as if they need to be fixed or anything else. Just listen to them. That's got to be an amazing experience for them.
I think it is, to be accepted as you are is rare and it's really important. So I'll tell you, I'm going to take it a little bit deeper and I'm going to say that I think people love to share their values with people who understand and have the same values. So I would love to see PET get out into the objectivist community because it is such a brilliant fit. Better than I've been trained in positive discipline and I've worked with Jane Nelson herself a fair amount. I forget the latest one that I just was exposed to. I mean, PET, it's just the gold standard. It really is. Because of this focus on everybody has to do their own, that objectivist virtue of independence. And Thomas Gordon was not an objectivist. I think he was a liberal. I don't know how most people who don't realize the logical extension of their ideas I
Yes.
don't think he would have thought that laissez-faire capitalism was the logical extension of PET, but it is. It is. It's just a brilliant fit.
All right. Before I let you go, I want to know it's obvious that this PET is effective and it's good with the children. What I want to know is how has it impacted you? How have these skills helped you to grow as a person and helped you to live a more fulfilling life?
Well, I was used to be very controlling. I've always thought, no, I've always used to be very controlling. So the shift from that to being deeply respectful, um, I have fabulous friends and they love me, and I think it's largely because I treat them with such deep respect. And my husband and I will celebrate our 29th anniversary. And PET has made a huge difference in how well we get along. My husband is severely allergic to being controlled in any way whatsoever. And he has a special sense for when I'm trying to, control. So when I had that agenda, he would like just forget it. And it took me a while to figure out that I had an agenda. Um, I was really disappointed when I learned that, but I was really glad to learn it because then I could let go without realizing it. I didn't know what I was doing, but when I figured it out, so life is good. I give Objectivism most of the credit for my life being so good, but PET teaches you how to put Objectivism into practice in communication and problem solving and in relationships. It's applied Objectivism in a particular sphere.
That is awesome. All right, Catherine. So, where can people find you?
Well, right now, somebody has offered to make a website for me, so we're going to start on that. But right now, I can just give out my email address,
Okay.
and it is Dickerson, Dickerson, 1 @gmail.com. Shall I say that one more time? I always need
Sure. Yeah.
Dickerson, 1 @gmail.com.
Okay. And when you get your website up and running, send me a link and I'll post it to my social media
Thank you very much. I really appreciate
accounts. Now, you also said that you had some books that you wanted to recommend.
Yes, yes. Okay, so since we've mostly been talking about PET, here's parent effectiveness training. For Montessori, there's nothing like reading The Montessori Method by Maria Montessori. And a very moving piece is Maria Montessori, Her Life and Work by E.M. Standing. He was her associate for a long time. He revered her and he writes about her with the respect that she deserves. And then if anybody has a baby, PET for Babies is Your Self-Calmed Baby by Magda Gerber. I started my career, I wanted to learn about the roots of mental health, so I started working with infants. And the difference, before I studied, I had the great good fortune to study with Magda Gerber. She's not with us any longer, but I studied with her in her classes that she taught. And the difference between before I studied with her and after was a lot of crying and a lot of giggling. It was amazing the difference it made. And this really is PET for Babies.
All right. Well, Catherine, thank you so much for reaching out to me and thank you for joining us today. And remember to get me that website, the link when
Okay.
you get it, okay?
Thanks so much for having me, Michael. It's been a joy to talk about these fabulous ideas.
It really has. For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Leibowitz. Till next time.